Mr. Tanen is the principal of the Lyndhurst Elementary School. All the children love him, and they also love his ties. Every morning, as the children enter the school, they check out Mr. Tanen's tie. It's a good way to start the day. Mr. Tanen has quite a tie collection. Funny ties, crazy ties, holiday ties, ties that play music, and even ties that light up. He also has a big collection of tourist ties. Anytime students go on a trip, they bring home ties for Mr. Tanen. His office closet bulges with ties.
He changed his tie several times a day, depending on his mood and whatever or what's for lunch in the cafeteria. On Frankfurter's Day, he always puts on his hot dog tie. No one will know if I get mustard on it, he says. If the weather suddenly changes, so does his tie. If he is wearing his umbrella tie, you know that it's raining even before you look outside. And for official duties, he always wears his red, white, and blue tie with yellow stars.
One day, Mr. Tanen had an important meeting with Mr. Apple at the school department. Everyone in town called Mr. Apple Mr. Crabapple because he was always grouchy and never smiled. Of course, Mr. Tanen wore the appropriate tie. Mr. Apple began, "You are a fine principal, but there is one thing that concerns me." "What's that, Mr. Apple?" asked Mr. Tanen.
"Education is serious business," said Mr. Apple. "Absolutely," agreed Mr. Tanen. "You are a role model for your students," said Mr. Apple. Mr. Tanen nodded. "Therefore, you should look proper at all times." Mr. Apple pointed to Mr. Tanen's tie, "and that is not proper." He handed Mr. Tanen a plain blue tie. "This is." "From now on, Mr. Tanen, keep your silly ties in your closet. You are to wear only blue ties." Mr. Tanen was shocked. "No sports ties with soccer balls? No. No tourist ties with palm trees and pink flamingos? No, Mr. Tanen. No light-up trees ties and Christmas? No, Mr. Tanen. Blue ties. Just blue." The next day, Mr. Tanen greeted the children as usual, but something was not right. "Mr. Tanen, your tie. It's just plain blue," said Alex. Mr. Tanen felt just plain blue. He sighed. "Sorry, kids, it's just proper blue from now on. Strict orders from Mr. Apple." "Boring," said Carla. "How are we going to know the weather?" asked Olivia. "Or what we're having for lunch," said Kaylee. Mr. Tanen shrugged sadly. Mr. Tanen did not feel like talking to anyone all morning. At lunch, he wished he had on his hot dog tie. When second grade celebrated Christian's birthday, he couldn't wear his special tie that played "Happy Birthday to You." Alex was worried. Mr. Tan is not the same, he thought. Early Monday morning, the school secretary phoned Mr. Apple. "Sir, Mr. Tanen just called in sick. He will be out all week with the blues. You will have to come to Lyndhurst School to fill in as principal." The children were surprised to see Mr. Apple greeting them. at the door. I will be your principal for the week. She snapped. Let's have straight lines, no talking, no running. I miss Mr. Tanen already, whispered Alex. That afternoon, Mr. Apple even made recess drills. No playing on the wet grass, he yelled. Go truck mud into school. Recess was no fun for the kids either. Were happy when the bell rang. As they were flying in, they saw Mr. Apple climbing a tree. What's he doing up there? Spying on us? Asked Keela. I can't believe it. He's birdwatching, said Olivia. He actually looks happy, said Coral. That gave Alex an idea. On Tuesday, Alex gave Mr. Apple a tie with birds on it. Thank you, Alex, but that's not quite my style. When he was all alone, Mr. Apple stared at the tie. Cardinals were my favorite bird, he thought. He held the tie up to his plain gray suit. He couldn't help but try it on. After school, Mr. Apple wore his new tie to the grocery store. Hello, Mr. Apple, said the cashier. Miss Sweet, good day, mumbled Mr. Apple. A lovely tie, commented Miss Sweet. You must like birds. I'm crazy about cats. Mr. Apple smiled a little. On Wednesday, Mr. Apple picked up his mail. Then he sat at Mr. Tanen's desk to work, but today he couldn't concentrate. He opened Mr. Tanen's closet and searched through the ties he found. Just what he was looking for. In the afternoon, he went to the grocery store again. He got on Miss Sweet's line checkout line. And Mr. Apple, now that's a charming tie. Mr. Apple and Miss Sweet chatted for a long time. On Thursday after school, Mr. Apple thumbed through Mr. Tanen's ties. Again this time he heard music. It was coming from a tie. Mr. Apple headed to the grocery store. When he got to the register, he pressed the tie. It's plain, let me call you sweetheart. Mr. Apple, I never knew you could be so delightful, said Mrs. Sweet. Mr. Apple handed Mrs. Sweet a rose. Will you have dinner with me tonight? I would love to, Mr. Apple. On Friday morning, Mr. Apple greeted the children wearing a tie with red hearts. Isn't that Mr. Tanen's Valentine's tie? Asked Alex. Mr. Apple grinned. Well, I don't think he'd mind if I borrowed it. Do you?
He won't mind, shouted all the kids.
On Monday, Mr. Tanen came back to school. Mr. Apple was waiting at the door. That tie, Mr. Tanen, grumbled Mr. Apple. Sorry, sir, got stain on it. Mustard? Apologized Mr. Tanen. Well, it's a good thing I bought you another one, said Mr. Apple. He handed Mr. Tanen a box. Mr. Tanen sighed. He opened the lid.
A big smile spread across his face. Just your kind of blue, said Mr. Apple, when Mr. Apple gave him a shopping bag filled with letters. The kids been writing me letters all week. They want their principal back, and so do I. Thank you, Mr. Apple.
One other thing, said Mr. Apple. Charlie, can you lend me this wedding bow tie I have? I have a important date tonight.